I wanted to extend our thanks to all of you, and particularly Lori Bridges, for being able to present this interesting topic. Lori Bridges is Instruction and Outreach Librarian at Oregon State University, and her topic is going to be on the languages in the World Wide Web. I saw Lori's presentation at IFLA actually, and it went really well, so I think this was a great opportunity for everyone to hear what she has to say, and the file will be shared as well. So Lori, you can take it from here.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yep.
Great. Okay, I'm going to be giving a presentation that I gave at IFLA in Wrocław, Poland in August. And Ray heard a little bit of it and asked if I could do a repeat performance. So I'm just going to do it exactly as I did at IFLA, which was that I read from a pre-written paper because it was translated into 5 languages as I gave the presentation. So today I'm here to talk about linguistic diversity in the internet. But before I do that, I want to share a little bit about someone I know who is an Oneida Native American. This is Max Sage. I met Max at my university last year. Even though Max is not fluent in his indigenous language, which is Oneida, he is one of 225 people who can speak the language. Max tells me that there are only 2 living elders who learned Oneida as their first language, and they are both over 90 years old. Max is very proud of the Oneida Nation's language revitalization efforts. The Oneida are a tribe of Native Americans who were traditionally located, before colonization, in the area that is now New York State. After colonization, the Oneida were forcefully displaced to 2 reservations in the United States, one in New York and the other in Wisconsin, and a third in Canada. In addition to forcibly moving Native Americans to reservations, colonizers did many horrible things, which included the re-education of Native children. Starting in the late 1800s, Native children were removed from their homes, sometimes voluntarily and sometimes at gunpoint, to one of nearly 150 boarding schools located throughout the United States. The guiding mission of these boarding schools was, quote, kill the Indian and save the man, end quote. And of course, eliminating indigenous languages was a large part of the re-education. Max's own grandfather was sent to one of these boarding schools. His grandfather was punished violently if he attempted to use his native language at the school. And it is in this way that his grandfather learned English and stopped speaking Oneida. Max actually told me that his grandfather to this day does not speak Oneida and actually knows another indigenous language better. A few weeks ago, I sat down with Max to ask him how he uses technology. Oops. Oh, sorry, drat. I started our conversation with Max asking him if the Oneida language has a written system. This is important because currently 2/3 of living languages do not have a written system, rendering them impossible to use on the read-write web. Max informed me that yes, the Oneida language uses the Roman alphabet for the written system. During our conversation, I learned that Max uses Facebook to connect with others who know the Oneida language. In addition, the Oneida Indian Nation websites provide language learning resources. And finally, Max makes frequent use of 2 apps on his smartphone created by the 2 Oneida nations in the US. I asked Max how the apps were created, and he said that the tribes hired computer programmers to create the apps and that the Oneida speakers and writers contributed the written and audio content for the app. As you can see in these screenshots, the app is used to help speakers look up correct wording, spelling, and pronunciation. As a librarian, I find the apps especially interesting because libraries could be involved in creating similar apps in support of revitalization efforts of minority languages. And perhaps they already are, and I have not heard about them. So Max's story brings me to the primary question I'm exploring today, which is the internet helping or hurting linguistic diversity? Based on a paper I co-authored last year, I would have said it is hurting linguistic diversity while spreading English as the lingua franca. However, now I am not so sure, and perhaps it is more complicated than I thought a year ago. Now, maybe you can remember life before the internet, or maybe you can't, depending on your age, where you live, and what languages you speak and write. But whatever you remember, the internet was developed, took root, and began its worldwide expansion in English from the primarily monolingual country of the United States. However, despite the English language dominance of the internet, in recent years a plurality of languages has begun to emerge, and the pace is quickening. First, let's take a look at English's dominance on the internet by the numbers. Here's a chart that is cited in many, many, many research articles and in the media, and it's created and updated by Internet World Stats. If you look at this table as I did, you might be thinking to yourself, oh, this is interesting. English and Chinese are very close. However, this table needs to be deconstructed and analyzed to truly understand what the numbers represent. First, the creators of this table assigned every internet user in the world with one language. Therefore, my language would be English, an internet user's language in China would be Chinese, and an internet user's language in Brazil or Portugal would be Portuguese. In this scenario, every internet user is assigned one language and uses only one language on the internet. However, we probably all know that this is not how multilinguals use the internet. Language researcher Thomas Christensen suggests that multilinguals likely use their own first regional language along with English on the internet. So to get a better picture of how the internet is being used by language, I think it's important to also consider this table from W3 Tech. Of the websites whose language content is known, 51% of those sites are in English, 7% in Russian, 6% in Japanese, 6% in German, etc. Intriguingly, on this table, we see that only 2% of the internet's content is in Chinese. What I want to show you with these two tables is simply that yes, for now, English is the dominant language on the internet, but exactly how many people are using English on the internet is not known. Now, before moving on, I also want to talk about the linguistic monopoly that English has in digital publishing. Open access publishing isn't so open when we consider how many articles are being published in English, and therefore inaccessible to non-English speakers. As a blog post for the Journal of European Psychology Students stated, quote, "In the scientific world, there is an unspoken rule that researchers must be fluent in English in order to obtain international recognition for their work," end quote. This, of course, presents barriers for researchers who cannot speak and write in English, and for citizens who could benefit from the research but are unable to read it. To further highlight the difficulties of obtaining online articles in languages other than English, one researcher in England conducted a small comparison study between Google Scholar, Scopus, and Web of Science. At the end of her article, she labels Google Scholar the multilingual source and Web of Science and Scopus as monolingual. A look at the requirements and search functions of Scopus and Web of Science tells us more. For inclusion, Scopus requires that a journal's, quote, content should be relevant and readable for an international audience. At minimum, have references in Roman script and English language abstracts and article titles, end quote. And Web of Science allows users to use one of 8 languages as the interface language, which includes English, simplified and traditional Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Portuguese, Russian, and Spanish. However, quote, search queries must always be in English. The results of your search are always in English, end quote. These limitations with Scopus and Web of Science are obvious barriers to anyone that does not write in English. Clearly, English is the dominant language on the internet. However, not all is lost. I'd now like to talk about the recent increases in the use of languages other than English on the internet. So I'd like to show you a few numbers again, but this time about languages other than English, specifically minority languages. For this section, I will use a definition of the Internet minority and majority languages from researcher Claudia Soraya. Soraya states that speakers of major languages can access apparently unlimited amounts of web content, easily perform searches, interact, communicate through social media and voice-based applications, end quote. However, speakers of minority languages do not benefit similarly and, quote, do not enjoy the same range of opportunities, end quote. Today, approximately 5% of the world's estimated 7,000 languages are represented online, or roughly about 300 languages. However, I cannot quite figure out how the UN came to this number of 300. Does this mean the languages that are active, languages that are archived? Another source reports that 1,500 languages can be found on the internet. However, whether it's 300 or 1,500, at most, 21% of today's living languages are online. Currently, according to the United Nations, more than half of the world's population does not use the internet. The UN estimates 2.5 billion people from developing countries and 1 billion from developed countries are using the internet, while 3.9 million are cut off. There are many reasons people are cut off from the internet, but language is primary among them. Now that I've shown you these numbers and you might be feeling a little disheartened for minority languages, I want to stress that there are some promising signs and trends relating to minority languages on the internet. In addition, some researchers are predicting that the internet is moving away from English dominance and toward what they call plural lingualism. Looking at the last 20 years, we can see that the percentage of internet pages in English have fallen. For example, in 1998, 85% of web pages were in English, 72% in 1999, 78% in 2000. And as I showed earlier, today it's estimated that 51% of websites are in English. It's interesting to note that it wasn't until 2007 that website URLs could be anything other than Roman alphabet. So even when the website was written in another script like Arabic or Chinese, the user still had to be able to type the web address using the Roman alphabet, another barrier early in the internet for minority languages. The online spaces where minority language use is really growing is what's called the informal internet. This includes Twitter, Facebook, online communities, and Wikipedia. As of August 2nd, 2017, there were 287 Wikipedias. That means that each language has its own Wikipedia, so there are 270 languages. Now, as a librarian, I'm always curious to learn what libraries can do to create a more socially just world. And I do want to share with you some suggestions for how we might play a part in increasing linguistic diversity on the internet. But first, I'd like to tell you about my internet friend, Catriona McIsaac. Catriona is a librarian at the University of Glasgow in Scotland. Catriona and I have been interacting for several years on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. When I first started following her, she would tweet every once in a while in a language I was not familiar with, and Google Translate did not work on her tweets. It said the language was unrecognizable. So when I asked her what language she was tweeting in, she replied Gaelic. Much like my friend Max of the Oneida tribe, Catriona did not learn Gaelic at home, although she was surrounded by Gaelic speakers, including her mother and several relatives. Also like Max, Catriona's grandfather and his classmates were physically punished for using Gaelic in school. As a teenager and of her own accord, she sought out a local community class for Gaelic, where she was the youngest student by at least 30 years. And she learned the language alongside adults. Although Catriona's high school did not teach Gaelic, Catriona requested the Gaelic exam for university placement, but her school refused. Her opinion is that Gaelic was seen as having low or no value in the early 1990s. Today, however, Gaelic is seeing a revival, and Catriona is married to a Gaelic speaker and raising her children with Gaelic as their first language. I asked Catriona how she uses technology to connect with Gaelic. She told me that she writes in Gaelic for her library's social media sites, including Facebook and Twitter. In her personal life, Catriona has connected with many Gaelic Twitter users. She uses apps on her phone from a Gaelic website along with a Gaelic dictionary. Catriona also says that she reads the news on the BBC in Gaelic, but the stories are limited, so she cannot use it as her primary news source, which she tells me she has complained to the BBC about numerous times. As I mentioned earlier, researcher Claudia Soraya has found that minority language speakers are connecting on the informal internet. Max and Catriona are examples of this. Both use social media to connect with other speakers. Max uses Facebook and Catriona Twitter. In addition to social media, they both use apps and dictionaries on their phones to further their speaking skills. Max and Catriona are part of an effort to revitalize languages, and they both rely heavily on the internet to interact with others and improve. Although English is currently the internet's lingua franca, there are ways that libraries and librarians can help promote the active use of minority languages. I'd like to wrap up this conversation by suggesting 3 ideas. My first and simple suggestion is that if you are a speaker of a minority regional language in your library, have the librarian or staff member compose tweets or Facebook posts in that language. Also encourage librarians, staff, and patrons to create a Wikipedia in their language or update and add to Wikipedia in other languages. And I actually, at the end, have a link to an article that recently came out about some initiatives on Wikipedia in other languages. Second, I mentioned that both Max and Catriona actively use phone apps to improve their language skills. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of apps to help people learn and improve language. And as we all know, libraries and archives hold audio recordings of minority languages. Many of those recordings are online. But after my conversations with Max and Catriona, I started wondering if any libraries or archives have developed phone apps aimed at providing short audio clips for language learners. I did some investigating and did not find anything. Of course, that does not mean it's not happening. I did find a lot of LibGuides, but I'm especially curious about ways libraries might engage with revitalizing minority languages through smartphones. If you know of anything, please let me know. Now, before I make my final suggestion, I need to make a confession, and that is that I am a monoglot. And if you are multilingual, you may think my final suggestion is odd because this is a routine part of your daily life. However, most English monoglot researchers in the US think of this as a new idea. At least when I tell them, they act surprised. It is to start publishing articles you write with abstracts in more than one language. You can start small, English and one other language. But then people ask me, how can they do this when they don't speak another language? I find that it's rather easy. Just ask a friend to translate your abstract into another language. This will allow speakers and readers of other languages to at least find your article. And while we're at it, please encourage the researchers at your universities to include abstracts in more than one language with their articles. Over the last 2 years, a coworker and I have submitted multilingual abstracts to 2 journals in our own university's institutional repository. Guess what? It was the first time for all 3 that anyone had requested submitting abstracts in more than one language. This may surprise you if you're multilingual because abstracts in more than one language are routine for many international journals. However, it is a rarity in the US, and librarians should advocate for language justice by submitting their abstracts in more than one language and also encouraging this practice in their IRs. So that's the conclusion of my presentation. I'll go back to the chat, and I'm happy to take any questions or talk about any ideas that you have. Thank you.
Thanks, Laurie. That was great. If anyone have any questions, please feel free to type them up, and we'll be here to address them. Lori, are you planning to extend or expand on this project in other ways?
Yeah, I'm looking into, Kelly and I have just submitted a proposal to write a call to action for ACRL News. And the call to action is simply that librarians need to start advocating for submitting abstracts in more than one language. And then some interesting work is coming out about how others are using Wikipedia. And there's some interesting stats about how many people go to Wikipedia as their first source for information in all languages. So I'm interested in doing a little more research on that as well.
Well, that's really interesting.
Maybe nobody has questions, or they don't know how to add a question.
Yeah, let me just type something here. So I also did want to add that the ACRL International Group, we will be hosting another webinar in the first week of November. I believe it's November 3rd. Let's get the dates mixed up because I'm working with overseas folks. It's 4th for them, but there will be 2 librarians from South Korea who will be presenting, and it will be at 4 p.m. Central Time and 7 p.m. Eastern Time because it works better for them at the 4th on Saturday at 8 a.m. for them.
Okay.
They'll be talking about, with Peter Bay, another librarian from Princeton University who works closely with South Korean libraries, and talking about the trends and opportunities happening there, including issues that they could discuss in terms of the context of North Korea. But if there are no questions, then we can wrap this up. This webinar is recorded, so we will share with everyone again in case people missed it.
Sounds great.